Sometimes life doesn't just knock you down, it takes everything you've built and leaves you standing in the ruins. That's exactly what happened to Matteo Alvarez at 50 years old when his divorce was finalized. He lost his savings, his home, and worst of all, contact with his grown children who stopped returning his calls. All he had left was a small piece of forgotten land his late uncle had given him years ago, buried deep in the tropical countryside. Most people would have seen it as the end, but Matteo grabbed some borrowed tools and drove out to that overgrown patch of earth. He began cutting back the wild growth, built himself a small shelter, and started planting seeds with his bare hands. What happened next would change everything. Could one broken man really build something amazing in just 12 months? Before we find out, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Matteo Alvarez had spent 25 years building what he thought was a successful life. He owned a small import business in the city, specializing in artisan goods from rural communities. The business had been profitable enough to buy a comfortable house in a decent neighborhood, put 3 kids through school, and maintain the appearance of middle-class stability. He'd been married to Claudia for 22 years, and for most of that time, he believed they were content, if not exactly happy. But somewhere along the way, the foundation had cracked. Maybe it happened slowly, imperceptibly, like roots breaking through concrete. Or maybe the cracks had always been there, hidden beneath the daily routines and polite conversations. The last 2 years of the marriage had been particularly hard. Claudia had grown distant, spending more time with her book club friends, taking weekend trips that Matteo wasn't invited to join. He'd buried himself deeper in work, telling himself that providing for the family was the same as being present for them. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning. Even though he'd known it was coming, seeing his name on those documents felt like a physical blow. The proceedings that followed were brutal in their efficiency. Claudia had already consulted a lawyer, already made plans. She'd found someone else, a retired accountant named Ernesto, who had time for long walks and afternoon coffees, all the things Matteo had been too busy to offer. Their 3 children, Gabriela, 26, and working as a nurse, Andres, 23, and finishing university, and Sophia, 20, still finding her way, had taken their mother's side, not overtly, not with declarations or confrontations, but through silence. Phone calls went unreturned, text messages sat unread. The rejection was clean and complete, as if the past 26 years had been erased with a few legal signatures. The settlement took almost everything. The house went to Claudia. It was only fair, the mediator said, since the children still visited her. Matteo's business had been struggling, and after legal fees and the division of assets, his savings account was nearly empty. At 50 years old, he found himself packing his belongings into his aging pickup truck, with nowhere to go and no one waiting for him. That's when he remembered the land. 15 years ago, at a family gathering, his uncle Ramon had pulled him aside. Ramon had been in his 70s then, a wiry man with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands. He'd lived most of his life in the countryside, farming a small plot and living simply. At the gathering, surrounded by cousins and second cousins, Ramon had pressed a folded document into Matteo's hands. "This is for you," Ramon had said, his voice quiet but firm. 5 acres in the hill country, about 4 hours from here. Not much to look at now, but it's good land. Been in our family for generations. Matteo had been puzzled. "Uncle, I can't accept this. What about your children?" Ramon had shaken his head. "They've got their own lives in the city. Don't want anything to do with farming or country living. But you, I see something in you, mijo. You work hard, but you're not connected to anything real. Sometimes a man needs earth under his feet to remember who he is." At the time, Matteo had smiled politely, thanked his uncle, and tucked the deed away in a drawer. He'd been too busy expanding his business, too focused on quarterly profits and supplier relationships. The land was just an abstraction, a piece of paper representing something he'd never seen and didn't need. Ramon had died 5 years ago, his funeral attended by dozens of people whose lives he'd touched. Matteo had been there, of course, but he'd left early to handle a business emergency. He'd forgotten about the land entirely until now, sorting through his remaining possessions in a storage unit, when he'd found the deed in an old filing box. The document was yellowed and creased, but the property description was clear. 5 acres in the municipality of Valle Verde, accessible by a dirt road off the main highway. Matteo had stared at that paper for a long time, sitting on a box in the storage unit, surrounded by the dismantled pieces of his former life. He had nowhere else to go. The drive took nearly 4 hours, winding through increasingly rural landscapes. The city's concrete gradually gave way to fields and forest, the air growing thicker and more humid as he descended into the tropical lowlands. He stopped once for gas and directions from a station attendant who knew the area. Valle Verde? Sure, I know it. Keep going another hour, you'll see the turnoffs. Not much out there, just some small farms and jungle. The dirt road was worse than Matteo had imagined, rutted and overgrown. His truck bounced and jolted, branches scraping against the sides. When he finally found the property markers, ancient concrete posts barely visible through the vegetation, his heart sank. The land was completely overgrown. Vines and brush had consumed everything, creating an impenetrable wall of green. Trees had grown up haphazardly, their branches tangled overhead. In the fading afternoon light, the place looked hostile, unwelcoming, impossible. Near what appeared to be the property's center, barely visible through the vegetation, stood an old shack on stilts. The structure was maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with weathered wooden walls and a rusted metal roof that had more holes than solid patches. A rickety ladder led up to a sagging porch. Matteo climbed the ladder carefully, testing each run. Inside, the shack was bare except for decades of dust, dead leaves, and evidence of various animals that had sheltered there. The floorboards creaked ominously under his weight. Through the holes in the roof, he could see the darkening sky. This was it. This was all he had left. He spent his first night lying on the wooden floor, using his jacket as a pillow, listening to the overwhelming sounds of the tropical night. Insects chirped and buzzed in rhythms he'd never heard before. Something large moved through the brush below, rustling leaves and snapping twigs. In the distance, a bird or monkey, he couldn't tell which, called out repeatedly, a lonely sound that echoed his own isolation. He didn't sleep much. Instead, he lay there in the darkness, thinking about how thoroughly his life had collapsed. 25 years of work, 22 years of marriage, 3 children he'd loved, with everything he had, all of it gone. And for what? To end up alone, in a falling apart shack in the middle of nowhere, with no plan and no future. When dawn finally came, pale light filtering through the trees and the holes in the roof, Matteo stood up stiffly and walked out onto the porch. The jungle stretched out in every direction, overwhelming and indifferent. He stood there for a long time, hands gripping the weathered railing, trying to decide what to do next. Eventually, he climbed down and walked to the edge of the property. Through a gap in the vegetation, he could see a small house, about a quarter mile away, the nearest neighbor. He had no tools, no supplies, nothing but what he'd packed in his truck. If he was going to survive here, even temporarily, he needed help. The walk took longer than expected, fighting through undergrowth and following what might have once been a path. When he finally emerged into a cleared area, an elderly man was sitting on a wooden chair outside the small house, drinking coffee and watching the morning. "Buenos dias," Matteo called out, suddenly aware of how he must look rumpled, exhausted, desperate. The old man studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Buenos dias. You must be the new owner of Ramon's old place." "You knew my uncle?" "Everyone knew Ramon." "Good man. I'm Esteban." He gestured to another chair. "Sit. You look like you could use some coffee." And so began Matteo's introduction to his new life, sitting with a stranger who had known his, Uncle, drinking bitter coffee as the tropical sun rose higher, discussing the reality of what lay ahead. Don Esteban, as Matteo would come to call him, listened to the story without judgment, then offered something Matteo hadn't expected: practical help. I've got some tools you can borrow. A machete, an axe, a shovel. Not much, but enough to start clearing. The land's been waiting a long time. It'll respond if you treat it right. That afternoon, Matteo began the work that would define the next year of his life. With Don Esteban's borrowed machete, he started cutting back the vegetation at the edge of the property, creating a small clearing near the shack. The work was backbreaking, his hands blistering within the first hour, his muscles screaming from movements his body hadn't made in decades. But there was something almost meditative about it. Each swing of the machete, each armload of cut brush dragged away, was concrete and real. Unlike the abstract world of business deals and spreadsheets, this work produced immediate, visible results. By evening, he'd cleared a space about 20 feet square, a tiny dent in the overwhelming task ahead, but a beginning nonetheless. He fell asleep that night before darkness even fully descended, too exhausted for the anxiety and regrets that had plagued him the night before. His last conscious thought was simple. Tomorrow, he'd clear a little more. 3 weeks into his new life, Matteo had established a rhythm that kept him moving forward. Wake at dawn, work until the heat became unbearable around midday, rest in the shade, then work again until sunset. The clearing had expanded significantly. He now had nearly a quarter acre of open ground near the shack, the earth dark and rich beneath the tangle of vegetation he'd removed. His body had changed in those 3 weeks. The softness around his middle had begun to disappear, replaced by a leaner, harder frame. His hands, once smooth from office work, were now calloused and scarred. His skin had darkened several shades under the relentless sun. When he caught his reflection in the truck's side mirror, he barely recognized himself. But the physical exhaustion served a purpose. It left little energy for the thoughts that wanted to consume him. Memories of family dinners, his children's laughter, the comfortable routines of his old life. At night, he fell into dreamless sleep, too tired even for nightmares. Don Esteban visited regularly, always in the late afternoon, when the worst heat had passed. He'd arrive with small offerings: a thermos of water, some rice and beans, once a worn book on tropical agriculture. The old man never stayed long, respecting Matteo's need for solitude, but his presence was a lifeline to human connection. On this particular afternoon, Don Esteban arrived, carrying something different, a small cloth bag that rustled as he walked. "You've done good work here," the old man said, surveying the cleared area. "But there's a problem." Matteo wiped sweat from his forehead. "What's that?" "A man who only clears is still destroying. You're taking away, not building. The land needs something from you besides removal." He held out the cloth bag. "These are seeds, tomatoes, peppers, some beans. Plant them." Matteo took the bag reluctantly. "Don Esteban, I appreciate this, but I'm not a farmer. I don't know anything about growing food. You know how to dig a hole and put a seed in it. The rest, the land will teach you." The old man's eyes were kind but firm. "Right now you're just surviving, but a man needs more than survival. He needs to create something, to see something grow because of his care." After Don Esteban left, Matteo stood holding the seed packet, feeling its weight in his palm. The old man's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk. A man who only clears is still destroying. Asterisk. That night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Matteo sat on the shack's porch and stared at the cleared earth below. The question Don Esteban had asked haunted him. Asterisk. What are you surviving for? Asterisk. He didn't have an answer. He'd been moving through each day with no thought beyond the next task, the next section to clear, the next small goal to achieve. But to what end? To clear 5 acres of jungle and then what? Sit alone in the middle of it, waiting to die? The darkness pressed in around him, heavy with humidity and the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Somewhere in the distance, he heard thunder rumbling, the promise of rain that would come before morning. He thought about his children, wondered what they were doing at this moment. Did they ever think about him? Did they care that he disappeared into the countryside with no plan and no future? The pain of that rejection still cut deep, but something had shifted slightly. The constant, raw ache had dulled to something he could carry, without it overwhelming him completely. When dawn came, Matteo made a decision. He took Don Esteban's seeds and began preparing the soil in a corner of the clearing. He had no experience with this, no training or knowledge, but he worked slowly and carefully, following half-remembered instructions from the agriculture book Don Esteban had loaned him. He dug shallow trenches, spaced them according to the book's diagrams, and placed seeds at regular intervals. His movements were uncertain, awkward. He had no idea if he was doing it correctly, if the spacing was right, if the seeds were too deep or too shallow. But he covered them with soil, patted it down gently, and watered the rows with buckets hauled from a nearby stream. As he worked, an unexpected memory surfaced. Years ago, when Andres was maybe 7 or 8, they'd planted flowers together for Mother's Day. Matteo had been impatient, rushing through it to get back to work emails, but Andres had been so careful, so deliberate with each small plant. "We have to be gentle, Papa," he'd said seriously. "They're alive." Matteo's hands stilled in the dirt. When had he stopped being gentle? When had everything become about efficiency and productivity, rather than care and attention? When had he forgotten that the things worth having required patience? The days that followed were strange. Matteo continued his clearing work, but found himself returning frequently to the planted area, checking for any signs of growth. Nothing appeared for nearly a week, and doubt crept in. The seeds were probably dead. He'd planted them wrong. This was foolish, a waste of time and effort. But on the 8th day, as he made his morning inspection, he saw them tiny green shoots pushing up through the dark soil. Just a few at first, then more, as he looked carefully along the rows. They were so small, so fragile, these first signs of life responding to his efforts. Matteo knelt in the dirt, staring at those fragile shoots, and felt something break open inside his chest. His eyes burned with unexpected tears. These plants existed because of him, because he'd prepared the soil and placed the seeds and provided water. Something was growing because of his care. For the first time in months, maybe years, he smiled. Not a polite social smile or a smile hiding pain, but a genuine expression of something like joy. That afternoon, he began planning a larger garden. Don Esteban's book described companion planting, natural pest control, water conservation techniques. Matteo read it carefully, taking notes in a worn notebook he'd found in his truck. He sketched rough layouts, calculated how many plants could fit in the cleared space, listed additional seeds he'd need. He was thinking weeks ahead, months ahead. For the first time since the divorce, he was imagining a future that extended beyond the next day's survival. When Don Esteban visited 2 days later, Matteo showed him the sprouting seedlings with barely contained excitement. The old man examined them carefully, nodded approval, then looked at Matteo with knowing eyes. "You see it now," Don Esteban said. "The land responds to those who care for it. Not always the way we expect, not always on our timeline, but it responds." That night, Matteo tried calling Gabriela. Her number rang twice before switching to voicemail. She'd blocked him. The pain of that rejection was sharp and immediate, but different now. He could acknowledge the hurt without being destroyed by it. He sat on the porch, looking at his garden area where tiny plants were pushing toward the light, and made a decision. He couldn't force his children to forgive him or want him in their lives, but he could channel that pain into something productive, something living and growing. He opened his notebook and began sketching a more ambitious garden plan, working by lamplight as insects buzzed around the flame. The design covered a full acre, with vegetables arranged in carefully planned sections, pathways between beds, a composting area, space for fruit trees that would take years to mature. Years. He was planning for years now, not just days. As he drew, he realized something fundamental had shifted. The seeds breaking through the soil had broken something in him too, the hopelessness, the belief that his life was over. If those tiny, fragile plants could push through darkness into light, maybe he could too. The garden wouldn't fix everything. It wouldn't bring his children back or undo the failures of his marriage. But it gave him something that clearing work hadn't a reason to imagine tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days stretching forward into a future he was beginning, cautiously, to want to see. 6 weeks into his transformation, Matteo's world had expanded beyond the boundaries of his small property. The garden now covered nearly half an acre, with neat rows of vegetables at various stages of growth. His first plantings, the tomatoes, peppers, and beans, were thriving, their leaves dark green and healthy. He'd added more crops as he learned. Leafy greens, squash, herbs that Don Esteban recommended. The physical work had reshaped him completely. His reflection in the stream where he bathed showed a different man, lean, muscled, sun-darkened. But the change went deeper than appearance. He moved with purpose now, each action deliberate and connected to a larger plan. His weekly trips to the village for supplies had become necessary routines. The Mercado Central was a sprawling collection of stalls and vendors, selling everything from fresh produce to household goods. Matteo had initially felt out of place among the locals who'd known each other for generations, but gradually, faces became familiar. One vendor in particular had caught his attention, an elderly woman named Lupita, who sold seedlings and seeds from a corner store. Her table was always covered with small pots containing various plants, each one labeled in careful handwriting. Matteo had bought from her several times, drawn by the quality of her plants and the obvious care she took with them. On this market day, Lupita studied him as he examined her seedlings. "You're the man living on Ramon's old place," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. I'm his nephew, Matteo. Ramon was a good man. He understood plants, understood the land." She reached under her table and pulled out a small wooden box. "These are special. Heritage seeds, tomatoes, peppers, beans that my family has grown for 4 generations. I don't sell these to just anyone." Matteo looked at the carefully labeled packets inside the box. "Why would you give these to me?" "Because I've been watching you. Every week you come, you ask questions, you listen. You're not here to play at farming, you're serious about it. Ramon would want these seeds to go to someone who'll respect them." She closed the box and pushed it toward him. "Plant them well." As Matteo drove back to his land, the box of seeds on the seat beside him felt like more than just packets of plant material. It was trust, legacy, connection to something larger than himself. That afternoon, he prepared a new section of garden specifically for Lupita's heritage varieties. As he worked, Lupita's story lingered in his mind. She'd mentioned her husband had built their farm from nothing 50 years ago. How many times had he wanted to give up? How many seasons of failure before success? Yet here was Lupita, still growing, still tending, still passing knowledge forward. Don Esteban arrived, as Matteo was finishing the new beds. The old man's cough had worsened recently, a deep, rattling sound that worried Matteo. "You should see a doctor about that cough," Matteo said. Don Esteban waved the concern away. "I'm old. Old men cough. Show me what you're planting." They walked through the garden together, Don Esteban offering observations and advice. He pointed out which plants looked stressed, which were ready for harvesting, where Matteo might add nitrogen-fixing plants to improve the soil. "You've learned fast," Don Esteban said. "The land is responding to you. I had a good teacher." The old man smiled, then the smile turned into another coughing fit. When it passed, his face was pale. Matteo insisted on walking him home, concerned by how frail he suddenly seemed. Don Esteban's house was small but well kept, with a tiny garden of its own. Inside, photographs covered the walls. A younger Don Esteban, with a beautiful woman, children at various ages, family gatherings spanning decades. Your family? Matteo asked. My wife passed 12 years ago. The children moved to the city long before that. Better opportunities, they said. They visit sometimes. Maybe twice a year. Don Esteban settled into his chair with visible relief. I understand why they left. There's not much here for young people. But I stayed. This is my home. Matteo saw himself in that loneliness, in the children who'd moved on with their own lives. The parallel was uncomfortable and clarifying at once. He began bringing vegetables to Don Esteban regularly, always finding some excuse he'd harvested too much, wanted Don Esteban's opinion on flavor, needed to test a new variety. They fell into a pattern of shared evening meals, two men whose families had drifted away, finding companionship in each other's company. The garden continued to expand. Matteo had begun composting, creating rich soil from kitchen scraps and garden waste. The cycle fascinated him, how death and decay became the foundation for new growth. There was something profound in that process, something that felt relevant to his own life. His next challenge emerged as the garden grew. Water. The nearby stream was adequate for current needs, but hauling buckets multiple times daily was exhausting and inefficient. He needed a better system. He spent several days researching rainwater catchment, sketching designs, calculating volumes. The rainy season would arrive soon. If he could capture and store that water, the garden would have reliable irrigation year-round, using salvaged materials from a demolition site in the village, old gutters, plastic barrels, PVC pipe. Matteo began constructing a collection system. The work was challenging, requiring skills he didn't have, but learned through trial and error. Felipe, a young man from the village, stopped by one afternoon and watched him struggling with the installation. You're doing it wrong, Felipe said bluntly. The angle's off. Water won't flow properly. Matteo straightened, frustrated. You know how to do this better. My father was a plumber before he died. I learned some things. Felipe studied the setup. Want help? Together, they rebuilt the system correctly. Felipe's knowledge combined with Matteo's determination, and by evening, they had functional water collection feeding into 3 large barrels. Why are you doing all this? Felipe asked as they worked. This is a lot of effort for a garden. Matteo considered the question. Because I need to. Because it's the only thing that makes sense anymore. Felipe nodded slowly. My father used to say, work makes the world solid under your feet. After he died, I understood what he meant. The first harvest came 6 weeks after those initial plantings. Matteo picked ripe tomatoes, peppers, and beans, filling a basket with produce he'd grown himself from seed. The abundance overwhelmed him far more than one person could eat. He distributed vegetables to Don Esteban, to Lupita at the market, to Felipe's family. The joy on their faces, the genuine gratitude, stirred something in Matteo. His old business had generated profit, but this created something people actually needed, something that nourished them directly. That night, cooking a meal entirely from his garden, Matteo realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd checked his phone, hoping for messages from his children. The constant ache of their absence hadn't disappeared, but it no longer dominated every moment. He was building something here, becoming someone different than the man who'd failed at marriage and fatherhood. He was becoming someone who grew things, who contributed, who belonged to a community not through transactions, but through shared effort and mutual care. As he ate, watching darkness settle over his garden, Matteo felt something he hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but a deep, quiet sense that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. 3 months into his new life, Matteo discovered something that would deepen his connection to both the land and his past. While organizing Uncle Ramon's old toolbox, the weathered wooden box that had become his most treasured possession, he found a photograph tucked beneath the removable tool tray. The image was faded, the colors washed out by time and tropical humidity. But the scene was clear. A younger Ramon, maybe in his 40s, stood in front of a small, cultivated plot. His sleeves were rolled up, dirt on his hands, and his expression carried the same quiet satisfaction Matteo now recognized in himself after a day's work. Matteo sat on the shack's porch, studying the photograph as afternoon light filtered through the trees. The resemblance between them was striking: the same strong nose, the same set to the jaw, the same calloused hands, shaped by physical labor. But more than physical similarity, there was something in Ramon's eyes that Matteo understood now in a way he never could have before. The peace that comes from working with the earth, from creating rather than consuming. He remembered a family gathering years ago, long before the land gift. Ramon had been talking about his simple life, about the satisfaction of growing food and living close to nature. Matteo, ambitious and busy building his business, had smiled politely, but internally dismissed it as the romantic notions of an old man who'd never understood modern life. Now, holding this photograph, Matteo felt shame at his younger self's arrogance. Ramon hadn't been naive or backward, he'd understood something fundamental that Matteo was only beginning to grasp. The garden had grown beyond what Matteo had initially imagined possible. His half-acre plot now included dozens of vegetable varieties, herbs, both culinary and medicinal, and young fruit tree saplings that wouldn't bear for years, but represented faith in a future he'd be here to see. He'd begun composting seriously, creating rich, dark soil from kitchen scraps, garden waste, and manure from a neighbor's goats. The transformation fascinated him, how refuse became resource, how death fed life. Every time he turned the compost pile, aerating it, and watching steam rise from its decomposing heart, he thought about his own transformation. Like the compost, he'd broken down completely. And like the compost, perhaps that breaking down was necessary for something new to grow. His understanding of the garden's ecology deepened daily. He noticed which plants attracted beneficial insects, which repelled pests, how certain combinations thrived while others struggled. The garden was teaching him to observe, to pay attention, to respond to what he saw rather than imposing preconceived plans. One morning, Padre Tomas appeared at the garden's edge. The village priest was a compact man in his 60s, with kind eyes and hands that showed he wasn't afraid of work. "I've been hearing stories about the city man who's growing vegetables," Padre Tomas said. "Thought I should see for myself." Matteo showed him around, explaining the layout and his plans for expansion. The priest listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own knowledge of agriculture. "My father was a farmer," Padre Tomas explained. "I grew up doing this work before I felt called to the priesthood, but I've always believed there's something sacred in it, cooperating with creation, helping things grow." They sat on the bench Matteo had built under a large shade tree, and their conversation drifted from gardening to deeper matters. "You came here broken," Padre Tomas said gently. "That's what people say, a man who lost everything." Matteo nodded. "That's accurate. But look at what you're building. God often strips us bare to show us what we're made of. Not as punishment, but as revelation." Matteo wasn't religious, hadn't been to church since his children were small, but something in the priest's words resonated. "I don't know if God had anything to do with it. I just didn't have anywhere else to go." Maybe that's exactly the point. Sometimes we need to lose all our other options before we find the one that was meant for us all along. After Padre Tomas left, those words stayed with Matteo. Had this been meant for him all along? Not the divorce, not the loss, but this land, this work, this transformation. Perhaps Ramon had seen something in him that he'd been too blind or too busy to see in himself. Don Esteban's health continued to decline. The cough persisted, and he'd grown noticeably thinner. Matteo brought him vegetables and soups, but knew his amateur remedies were inadequate. Don Esteban refused to see a doctor, waving away Matteo's concerns. "I'm 83 years old. the old man said. Doctors can't fix that. Matteo tried using some of the medicinal herbs Lupita had taught him about: teas for coughs, poultices for chest congestion. He had no real faith in their effectiveness, but Don Esteban seemed comforted by the care more than the remedies themselves. You have healer's hands now, Don Esteban said one evening as Matteo prepared him tea, not businessman's hands. Do you feel the difference? Matteo looked at his scarred, calloused palms. Yes, these hands actually do something real. They always did something real. But now you can see it, touch it, taste it. The market became a weekly highlight. Matteo would arrive early, his truck loaded with produce, and set up near Lupita's seedling store. He didn't sell his vegetables, didn't need the money yet, but gave them away to families who needed them. One morning, a young mother named Paloma approached hesitantly. She had 2 small children clinging to her skirts, their clothes worn but clean. Everyone says you know how to grow food, she said quietly. Could you teach me? My children, we don't have much, and vegetables at the market are expensive. Matteo looked at the children's thin faces and felt something crack open in his chest. Come to my place tomorrow. I'll give you seedlings and show you how to start. Paloma arrived the next day with her children, who stared wide-eyed at the abundant garden. Matteo gave her seedlings, compost, and careful instructions. As he taught her about spacing, watering, and basic care, he discovered something surprising: he was good at this. The communication skills from his business years, the patience learned from the garden, combined into an ability to teach clearly and encouragingly. 2 weeks later, Paloma returned with questions. Her small garden was starting to grow, but she needed advice on a struggling plant. Matteo helped her troubleshoot, and as they talked, she mentioned that other mothers in the village had asked about learning too. Could you teach them? She asked hopefully. The idea was daunting. Teaching one person was different from teaching a group. But looking at Paloma's eager face, thinking about the undernourished children he'd seen at the market, Matteo heard himself agreeing. His evenings, once spent alone with his thoughts, now filled with planning. He sketched simple diagrams, wrote out basic instructions, organized his knowledge into teachable segments. The work absorbed him completely, leaving no room for the grief and regret that used to consume his nights. He still had moments of weakness. One evening, he drove to the city, parking near the cafe where Gabriella sometimes met friends. He sat in his truck for an hour, hoping to glimpse her, needing some connection to his former life. When she finally appeared, laughing with companions, looking happy and whole, the pain was sharp and immediate. She didn't need him. None of them did. He drove back to his land with tears on his face, but didn't stop at any bars, didn't seek oblivion or distraction. Instead, he went directly to the garden, walking the rows in darkness, touching the plants he'd nurtured from seeds. This was his family now, these growing things that depended on his care and responded to his attention. It wasn't enough to fill the hole his children's absence had left, but it was something, and maybe, eventually, something would be enough. 5 months into his transformation, Matteo's garden had become a living ecosystem. The neat rows of vegetables now shared space with native plants that attracted pollinators. Birds visited regularly, feasting on insects and spreading seeds. Butterflies danced between flowers. The land had transformed from hostile jungle to a thriving collaboration between human intention and natural abundance. Matteo's morning ritual had become sacred. He'd wake before dawn, brew coffee over his small propane stove, and walk through the garden as the world shifted from darkness to light. With a notebook in hand, he'd record what had changed overnight, which plants had flowered, where insects had appeared, what needed attention. This quiet observation replaced the frantic email checking and schedule juggling of his former life. The village had started talking about Matteo's miracle garden. The description embarrassed him. There was no miracle, just consistent work and attention, but he couldn't deny that people were curious. Elderly farmers would appear at the garden's edge, studying his methods. Young families asked questions about companion planting and natural pest control. Don Esteban had encouraged him to formalize the teaching. Don't hide what you know. Share it. That's how knowledge stays alive. So, Matteo built a bench under the large shade tree. At the garden's heart, it was simple construction, rough-hewn wood that would weather naturally, but it created a gathering space, a place where people could sit and learn. The first informal teaching session happened almost accidentally. Paloma arrived with questions, and 2 other women from the village came with her. Matteo showed them companion planting, how marigolds protected tomatoes from pests, how beans fixed nitrogen in soil that corn depleted, how the 3 sisters method of corn, beans, and squash created mutual support. The women absorbed everything eagerly, but they also shared knowledge their grandmothers had taught them: traditional planting schedules based on moon phases, old remedies for plant diseases, songs that supposedly encouraged growth. Matteo listened as carefully as he taught, realizing that learning flowed in both directions. "You're not just teaching us," one woman said. "You're reminding us of things we'd forgotten." Word spread, and by the following Saturday, 8 people had arrived for what was becoming a regular morning session. Matteo found himself organizing the information, creating verbal presentations that built logically from basics to more complex techniques. His business skills presenting, organizing, communicating proved unexpectedly useful. Then the letter arrived. A forwarded envelope from his old address, official and impersonal. Inside was the final divorce decree, the legal culmination of his marriage's dissolution. The document itemized everything: asset divisions, property transfers, financial obligations completed. 22 years reduced to legal language and dollar amounts. One line caught his eye, the description of his current property as undeveloped rural parcel. Minimal value. Minimal value. This land that had saved his life, this place where he'd rebuilt himself from nothing, was officially worth almost nothing in the eyes of the law. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt so much. He sat in the shack that night, document in hand, and felt the old panic returning. Was he just hiding here? Was this garden just an elaborate form of avoidance, a way to escape the reality that he'd failed at what really mattered: marriage, family, fatherhood? He slept poorly, dreams filled with courtrooms and his children's disappointed faces. Morning brought no clarity, just exhaustion and doubt. Don Esteban arrived mid-morning, took one look at Mateo's face, and said, "Show me what's wrong." They sat on the bench, and Matteo showed him the decree. Don Esteban read it slowly, then set it aside. "This paper says the land has minimal value," the old man said. "But how many people come here each week to learn? How many families are eating better because of what you've taught them? How many children have fuller bellies because their mothers now know how to grow food?" He tapped the document with one finger. "The law measures value in money. But a man who feeds others isn't hiding. He's building something that matters more than any bank account." The words settled Mateo's churning thoughts. He looked at his garden, at the abundance growing there, at the gathering space he'd created, at the evidence of his own hands' work, and felt the panic recede. That afternoon, he introduced more advanced techniques to his Saturday group: mulching to retain water and build soil. The concept of permaculture zones, organizing the garden by frequency of care needed, creating swales and berms to capture and direct water. As he taught, Matteo realized he was genuinely enjoying himself. The old satisfaction from closing a business deal paled compared to the light in someone's eyes when they understood a new concept, when they saw how simple changes could transform their own small plots. Lupita arrived during one session, bringing a small wooden box. "This is for you," she said. "Seeds my grandmother saved, too precious to sell, but you'll use them right." Inside were varieties Matteo had never seen: rare peppers, ancient bean cultivars, tomatoes with names in indigenous languages. Each packet was labeled in fading ink, with notes about optimal growing conditions and traditional uses. "These need to be shared," Lupita said firmly. "Not hoarded. Grow them, save seeds, give them to others who will respect them." The concept sparked an idea. That evening, Matteo built a small weatherproof box and mounted it at the garden's entrance. He created simple cards explaining the concept. A community seed library. Take seeds you need, grow them, save seeds from your harvest and return them. Knowledge and abundance multiplying through sharing rather than hoarding. The seed library filled quickly with contributions. Farmers brought varieties their families had grown for generations. The diversity was astonishing, dozens of plant varieties adapted to local conditions, carrying stories and histories in their genetic code. Saturday sessions grew to 12, then 15 regular participants. People brought friends and relatives. Matteo created hand-drawn guides for basic techniques, simple illustrations anyone could follow. His organizational instincts took over, structuring information clearly and building systematically from foundational knowledge to advanced methods. One evening, he realized with surprise that he hadn't thought about his business in weeks. The constant mental calculations, profit margins, supplier relationships, inventory management had simply dissolved. That part of his brain had gone quiet, replaced by different calculations about growing seasons, companion planting combinations, and water management. His old identity was fading like a dream. He'd been a businessman, a husband, a father. Now he was simply Matteo, gardener, teacher, community member. The new identity felt more solid, more real, than all his previous roles combined. He wasn't hiding from his failures. He was building something new on their ruins. And perhaps that was exactly what he needed to do, not to forget or erase the past, but to use it as foundation for a different kind of future. As he walked through the garden at sunset, Matteo felt a profound shift in his understanding. The divorce hadn't destroyed his life, it had only destroyed the life he'd been living, a life built on shaky foundations, on activity without meaning, on roles he'd never fully inhabited. This garden, this community, this daily work with soil and seeds and growing things, this was real, this was solid. This was a life he could build on, a foundation that wouldn't crumble when tested. 6 months into his journey, the rainy season arrived with dramatic intensity. The sky would darken in early afternoon, and water would fall in sheets that turned the world gray and roaring. Matteo had worried the heavy rains might damage his garden, wash away soil, drown delicate plants. Instead, the garden thrived. The swales and berms he'd constructed directed water exactly where needed, preventing erosion while ensuring deep soil saturation. The mulch he'd spread protected plant roots and kept soil from washing away. Every system he'd put in place proved its worth as water poured from the sky. He stood in the rain one afternoon, watching water flow along carefully planned channels, and felt a deep satisfaction. He'd learned to work with nature rather than against it, to anticipate and prepare rather than react and repair. Later that evening, while organizing paperwork in the shack, Matteo found something unexpected in his wallet, a faded crayon drawing, folded small and tucked behind expired credit cards. He unfolded it carefully, the paper threatening to tear along its creases. 5 stick figures holding hands beneath a smiling sun, a house with a triangle roof, flowers scattered across green grass. In the corner, written in a child's uncertain letters, "My Family," by Sophia, age 6. That would make the drawing 14 years old. Matteo had carried it all this time without remembering it was there. He sat on the shack's porch, rain drumming on the metal roof, and let himself feel the full weight of his loss. Sophia would be 20 now, no longer the little girl who'd drawn this picture. Gabriella was 26, Andres 23, adults, living their own lives, making their own choices, carrying their own wounds from the divorce. The tears came then, mixing with rain that blew through holes in the roof. He cried for the father he'd failed to be, for the years he'd spent building a business while his children grew up barely knowing him, for the marriage he'd let wither through inattention. But he also cried with a different kind of grief, not the raw, desperate anguish of early loss, but something deeper and more accepting. His children had their own lives now. He couldn't force reconciliation or demand forgiveness. All he could do was leave the door open and become someone worth reconciling with. Don Esteban found him sitting in the rain an hour later. The old man didn't say anything at first, just sat beside him on the wet porch, letting his own clothes get soaked. "Rain feeds everything," Don Esteban finally said. "Even sorrow has its season. You can't rush it or avoid it. You just have to let it fall, and trust something will grow from it." That night, Matteo made a decision. He would write letters to each of his children, not asking for anything, not demanding responses, just sharing his truth. He'd tell them about the garden, about what he'd learned, about who he was becoming. Whether they ever read the letters didn't matter. Writing them was the point. He spent 3 evenings composing those letters, crossing out false starts, struggling to find honest words that didn't sound like excuses. To Gabriela, he wrote about learning to care for growing things, and wishing he'd brought that same patient attention to being her father. To Andres, he shared the satisfaction of building something with his hands, and the regret that he'd never made time to teach him such skills. To Sophia, he simply apologized for the divorce, for taking sides even when he tried not to, for not fighting harder to stay in her life. He sealed the letters, addressed them, and placed them in a drawer. Maybe he'd send them someday. Maybe he wouldn't. But writing them had helped him process feelings he'd been pushing down for months. The garden continued evolving. Young fruit trees he'd planted were showing their first blooms, papaya, mango, citrus varieties. They wouldn't produce fruit for years, but those blooms represented faith in a future he'd be here to witness. He was planting for tomorrow, for next year, for a decade from now. The concept moved him deeply. For the first time in his adult life, he was thinking beyond immediate returns and quarterly results. He was investing in something that would outlast him, benefit people he might never meet, contribute to a future he could only imagine. Padre Tomas returned with an unexpected request. The local government was promoting kitchen gardens as part of a food security initiative, and officials wanted a community meeting to generate interest. Would Matteo speak about his experience? The thought terrified him. Standing in front of a crowd, being the center of attention, potentially being judged or questioned, it triggered all his old anxieties. He'd been living quietly, peacefully, in relative solitude for months. Public speaking felt like exposure, vulnerability. But he thought about Paloma's children, about families struggling to afford nutritious food, about knowledge that could multiply if shared. He agreed. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday. Matteo spent evenings preparing, organizing his thoughts, creating visual aids from actual plants he'd bring from the garden. His hands trembled as he worked, old fears about not being good enough surfacing. The night before the meeting, he barely slept. What if people asked questions he couldn't answer? What if his methods didn't work for others? What if he failed publicly, adding this to his list of failures? Morning came too quickly. Matteo loaded his truck with plant samples, compost, and hand-drawn diagrams. His stomach churned as he drove to the community center. 30 people had gathered in the meeting room, more than he'd expected. They watched him with expressions ranging from curious to skeptical as he set up his materials with shaking hands. He started by telling the truth. 6 months ago, I came here with nothing. I'd lost my marriage, my home, my savings, contact with my children. All I had was land I'd never seen and no idea what to do with it. His voice steadied as he continued. I didn't know anything about farming or gardening. I made mistakes, plenty of them, but the land taught me something important. If you prepare the soil, plant with care, and pay attention, growth happens. Sometimes slowly, sometimes in ways you don't expect, but it happens. He demonstrated techniques with the plants he'd brought, explaining companion planting, composting, water management. He showed his failures alongside his successes, the plants that had died, the methods that hadn't worked, the lessons learned through error. The garden taught me more than I taught it, he concluded. It taught me patience, observation, and that growth takes time. It taught me that starting with nothing doesn't mean you'll end with nothing. The questions came rapidly after that. People wanted to know about specific plants, how to start with limited space, whether certain methods would work in different soil types. Matteo answered as best he could, admitting freely when he didn't know something. After the formal session, several people approached with more questions. A young man named Felipe asked if he could work with Matteo to learn properly. I was just laid off from the factory, Felipe explained. I have a family to support and no job prospects, but if I could learn to grow food, maybe teach others, that could be something. Matteo hesitated. He'd been enjoying his solitude, the freedom to work at his own pace without responsibility for anyone else. Taking on a student meant commitment, accountability, the risk of disappointing someone else. But he remembered the people who'd helped him, Don Esteban, Rupita, the entire community that had welcomed a stranger. He'd been given chances when he had nothing to offer. Come tomorrow morning, Matteo said. We'll see how it goes. 7 months into his new life, Matteo woke to a different kind of morning. Felipe had become a dedicated student, arriving at dawn and working alongside him with quiet determination. The young man learned quickly, asked smart questions, and brought energy that balanced Matteo's more methodical approach. Their partnership had developed into comfortable collaboration. The garden had reached peak productivity. Vegetables grew in abundance, more than Matteo and his small circle could consume. He'd started regular donations to families in need, and the Saturday teaching sessions now drew 20 regular participants. Life had found a rhythm that felt sustainable, even peaceful. Then, the stranger arrived. Matteo was showing Felipe proper pruning techniques when he noticed a man in clean slacks and a button-down shirt picking his way carefully along the garden path. Everything about him, the polished shoes, the leather briefcase, the way he held himself apart from the dirt, signaled he didn't belong here. Good morning, the man called out. I'm looking for Matteo Alvarez. That's me. Matteo set down his pruning shears, wiping soil from his hands. Excellent. I'm Guillermo Vasquez, from the County Development Office. Just doing routine property assessments in this region. He pulled out a tablet and stylus. Mind if I look around? Something in the man's casual tone set off warning bells, but Matteo couldn't refuse without seeming suspicious. Go ahead. Vasquez walked through the garden, taking photos with his tablet, making notes, occasionally measuring distances with a laser tool. He stopped frequently, capturing images of the structures Matteo had built. The water collection system, the tool shed, the small guest cabins Felipe had helped construct. Quite an improvement to the property, Vasquez said, smiling. You've increased the land value substantially. Those words landed like a stone in Matteo's chest. Land value. He watched the assessor photograph the garden's most developed sections, document every structure and improvement, and felt growing unease. This is just routine? Matteo asked. Completely routine. County reassesses all properties every few years. With the regional development happening, we're updating valuations across the area. Vasquez closed his tablet. You'll receive official documentation in about a week. Have a good day. After he left, Felipe looked at Matteo's troubled face. That didn't sound good. No, Matteo agreed. It didn't. The official envelope arrived 6 days later. Matteo opened it with trembling hands, already knowing what he'd find, but hoping he was wrong. Property tax assessment notice. The words blurred as his eyes jumped to the crucial number. His annual property tax had increased by 400%. The new amount exceeded his entire remaining savings. He read the justification. Based on substantial property improvements and regional development trends, assessed value revised from minimal agricultural to improved residential agricultural. Everything he'd built, every structure, every cultivated bed, every improvement that made the land livable and productive had been counted against him. By making the place valuable to himself and his community, he'd made it expensive to keep. Matteo sat on his porch, document in hand, feeling the world tilt. He couldn't afford this tax. Even if he found work, with no formal income history, no bank would give him a loan, and the amount would only increase. Each year, as development continued, he'd lose everything. Again. That evening, he drove to Don Esteban's house and showed him the assessment. The old man read it slowly, his face growing grim. "This is happening everywhere," Don Esteban said. "3 of my neighbors sold last year. Developers made big offers, and people needed the money. But it's changing everything." He coughed, the sound rattling and wet. "There's a coastal resort development planned about 10 kilometers from here. Land values across the entire region are skyrocketing. What am I supposed to do? I can't pay this. I don't know, mijo, but I know you can't be the only one facing it." Matteo spent the next 2 days researching. Don Esteban was right, a massive development project was transforming the coast. Luxury resorts, golf courses, private beaches. Property values were exploding, and with them, taxes. Small landholders were being systematically priced out, forced to sell to developers who consolidated properties into large holdings. It was a pattern he recognized from his business days: economic pressure applied strategically to force desired outcomes. The government wanted development, wanted the tax revenue and jobs that came with resort construction. Small farmers and simple living didn't fit that vision. Word spread quickly through the village. When Matteo arrived for Saturday's teaching session, he found 20 concerned faces waiting. "We heard about the tax assessment," Paloma said. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet. I'm looking at options. But," his voice broke, "I might not be able to stay." The community's response was immediate and overwhelming. People offered what they had: small amounts of money, labor, help with appeals. It was touching but insufficient. The gap between what they could contribute and what he needed was too large. Padre Tomas suggested an idea. "What if the garden itself is the answer? You've been teaching for free, but people pay significant money for this kind of education. Eco-tourism is growing. What if you formalized it, offered courses, workshops, maybe farm stays? Use your business experience combined with what you've built here." The suggestion sparked discussion. Lupita mentioned that urban people paid substantial sums to learn sustainable living skills. Felipe volunteered to help build proper accommodations for paying students. Others offered their expertise: marketing, cooking, traditional crafts that could enhance the educational experience. But Matteo felt paralyzed by conflicting emotions. He'd come here to escape business, to find simplicity and peace. Turning the garden into a commercial venture felt like betraying everything he'd discovered. Would charging money corrupt what made this place special? Would structure and schedules destroy the organic relationships that had developed? Yet the alternative was losing everything. The garden, the community connections, the life he'd rebuilt from nothing, all of it, threatened by a tax bill he couldn't pay. That night, unable to sleep, he walked through the garden under starlight. The plants rustled in the breeze, indifferent to his crisis. They simply grew, adapted, responded to conditions. When wind blew, they bent. When rain came, they drank. When seasons changed, they transformed. Don Esteban's words came back to him. The garden teaches adaptation. Plants that resist the wind break. Flexible ones survive. Matteo had resisted change once before, clinging to a failing marriage and a business that drained him. That resistance had led to collapse. Now he faced another choice: resist and lose everything, or adapt and risk losing what made it meaningful. He thought about the photograph of Uncle Ramon, about the legacy of this land, about the community that had formed around it. This wasn't just about him anymore. The garden had become something larger, a resource, a gathering place, a source of knowledge that was multiplying through the people he'd taught. Maybe expansion wasn't betrayal, Maybe it was the next necessary stage of growth. As dawn approached, Matteo made his decision. He would fight to keep the land, but he'd do it by embracing change rather than resisting it. He'd build something sustainable, something that could generate income while preserving the garden's essential character. Whether he could pull it off remained uncertain, but doing nothing guaranteed failure. At least this way, he'd be trying. He just hoped that in saving the garden, he wouldn't destroy what made it worth saving. The transformation from informal teaching to formal educational center required skills Matteo hadn't used in months. He pulled out an old notebook and began writing what amounted to a business plan, something he'd sworn never to do again. But this was different. This wasn't about profit margins and market expansion. This was about survival and sustainability. He mapped out a strategy. Weekend workshops for beginners, 2-day intensive courses covering basics of permaculture, composting, and food production. Week-long immersion programs for serious students wanting comprehensive knowledge. Volunteer opportunities for people willing to work in exchange for learning. Each tier would generate income while maintaining the garden's educational mission. Felipe's role expanded immediately. The young man had construction skills from watching his father work, and he threw himself into building proper guest facilities. Using salvaged bamboo, reclaimed wood, and materials donated by community members, they began constructing 2 small cabins and an outdoor classroom with a roof for rainy season sessions. The community invested themselves in the project with remarkable generosity. The village carpenter built simple but sturdy furniture. Women from the church sewed linens and curtains. Young people helped with landscaping around the new structures. It felt less like Matteo's project and more like a collective effort to preserve something everyone valued. Lupita transformed the seed library into a proper educational resource. She labeled each variety with growing information, historical context, and traditional uses. Her lifetime of knowledge became a cornerstone of what they'd teach, indigenous wisdom integrated with modern permaculture principles. Padre Tomas offered the church hall for evening seminars on sustainable living philosophy. Don Esteban, despite his worsening health, advised on traditional farming methods that had sustained communities for generations. Matteo created marketing materials, photographing the garden in morning light, writing descriptions that emphasized authentic learning over luxury accommodations. Felipe's teenage sister, comfortable with social media in ways Matteo wasn't, helped create an online presence targeting urban professionals interested in sustainable living. The first booking came 2 weeks later, a couple from the capital city wanting to attend a weekend workshop. Matteo's anxiety spiked immediately. What if he wasn't good enough? What if formalizing everything destroyed the natural, easy teaching that had developed organically? What if he was selling something he couldn't actually deliver? Don Esteban found him pacing the garden path the night before the workshop. "You're worried you're selling out," the old man said. "It wasn't a question. I came here to escape business, to find something real. Now I'm turning it back into transactions and schedules." "You're not selling out. You're sharing. There's a difference." Don Esteban settled onto the bench, breathing labored. "People are paying for your time and knowledge, yes. But what you're giving them, teaching them to feed themselves, to live sustainably, to connect with the earth, that's not a transaction. That's a gift they're helping make possible." The preparation week was intense. Cleaning, organizing, rehearsing presentations, making sure every detail reflected the quality and authenticity they wanted to represent. The community's excitement grew alongside Matteo's anxiety. This workshop was validation that their way of life, their knowledge, had value beyond their small village. During this frantic preparation, Matteo experienced an unexpected moment of clarity. He was building a new structure for shade plants when he realized he was happy. Not distracted from pain, not temporarily content, but genuinely happy in the work itself, in the community effort, in the purpose driving everything forward. That night, he wrote in his journal a habit that had developed alongside the garden. "I spent 25 years building a business I didn't love, pursuing success I didn't want, maintaining a life that never fit. I lost it all, and thought I'd lost everything. But I'd only lost what wasn't real. What I'm building now, this matters. This is real. He pulled out the letters he'd written to his children months ago and showed them to Don Esteban. I never sent these. I kept thinking I'd wait until I was more settled, more successful, more worthy of reconciliation. And now I think I'm not ready yet. Neither are they. But someday maybe, when I've fully become who I'm meant to be, we can try again. The first workshop weekend arrived with 4 participants instead of 2. The original couple plus 2 friends who'd heard about it. They were young professionals from the city, seeking practical skills for sustainable living, carrying the stress and disconnection that Matteo remembered from his own urban life. He taught with confidence he hadn't known he possessed. His presentations were organized and clear, building logically from foundational concepts to practical applications. He shared failures alongside successes, admitted uncertainties, encouraged questions. The honesty seemed to resonate more than perfection would have. The hands-on learning formed the heart of the experience. Participants planted seeds, turned compost, harvested vegetables, and cooked meals from the garden. Felipe assisted, bringing youthful energy and a different teaching style that complemented Matteo's methodical approach. Evening sessions explored permaculture, philosophy, and design principles. But the real magic happened during shared meals with villagers. Authentic cultural exchange occurred naturally, stories shared, laughter exchanged, connections formed across the urban-rural divide. By Sunday evening, the participants' transformation was visible. They moved differently, spoke differently, carried themselves with less tension. The weekend had given them more than gardening skills. It had provided a glimpse of a different way of being. Their feedback was overwhelming. All 4 committed to returning and bringing friends. One asked about longer volunteer opportunities, wanting to spend a month learning comprehensively. But the financial reality remained sobering. The workshop income was significant, but insufficient. Matteo needed consistent bookings. Multiple revenue streams produce sales at farmers markets, value-added products like dried herbs and preserves, expanded workshop schedules, private consulting for people wanting to design their own gardens. 3 months until the tax deadline. The pressure was constant and exhausting, yet momentum was building. Bookings increased as word spread. A regional newspaper ran an article titled, "From Broken to Blooming," capturing Matteo's story of personal redemption through agriculture. The journalist had interviewed community members, photographed the garden, and written with genuine understanding of what had been built here. The article brought unexpected consequences. More bookings, certainly, but also an email notification that made Matteo's hands shake. Message from Gabriela. Subject line, "I saw the article about you." He stared at the notification for several minutes before opening it, savoring the possibility before confronting the reality. The message was brief, cautious, but not hostile. "Dad, I saw the newspaper article about what you're doing. It sounds like you're building something good there. Maybe we could talk sometime?" Matteo read it 3 times, searching for hidden meanings or conditional clauses. There were none. Just a daughter extending a tentative olive branch to a father she'd cut from her life 8 months ago. He wanted to respond immediately, to pour out everything he'd learned and experienced, to apologize again for all his failures. But wisdom held him back. He'd learned patience from the garden. Seeds didn't grow faster because you wanted them to. Growth happened in its own time. He wrote simply, "I'd like that very much. Whenever you're ready. I'm here." After sending it, he sat on his porch, watching stars emerge. The garden had given him purpose and community. Now, maybe, it was returning something he'd thought lost forever, the possibility of family. 1 month until the community fundraiser. 1 month to find the remaining money needed. 1 month to see if what he'd built could survive. The fundraiser transformed the village square into something magical. Lanterns hung from trees, their warm light casting dancing shadows across tables loaded with food. A small band played traditional music, the sound mixing with conversation and laughter. Matteo stood at the edge of the gathering, overwhelmed by the turnout. Over 100 people had come, families who'd attended his workshops, bought his produce, or simply heard about his struggle. The support felt both humbling and uncomfortable. He'd never wanted to be anyone's charity case. The auction began as the sun set. Items donated by the community filled several tables. Lupita's heritage seeds, packaged in decorative boxes she'd made herself, sparked a bidding war that drove prices far beyond their practical value. People weren't buying seeds, they were buying a chance to contribute. Felipe had built furniture pieces specifically for the auction, a simple but beautiful bench, a potting table, garden boxes. Workshop participants from the city bid enthusiastically, wanting tangible reminders of what they'd learned. Matteo's consulting services, personalized garden design, and ongoing advice surprised him by generating intense interest. People wanted not just the knowledge, but the connection, the ongoing relationship with someone who understood both the practical and philosophical dimensions of growing food. Between auction items, community members stood to share testimonials. Paloma spoke about how garden knowledge had transformed her family's nutrition, how her children now ate vegetables they'd grown themselves. An elderly farmer credited Matteo's advice with saving crops that would have failed. A young couple explained how they were planning their future around sustainable food production, inspired by what they'd learned. Each story hit Matteo with unexpected force. He hadn't fully grasped the ripple effects of what he'd started. The garden wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a catalyst for broader transformation. Don Esteban stood with visible effort, his voice thin but determined. Matteo came here broken, and we thought we were helping him. But he showed us something we'd forgotten, that our land, our knowledge, our way of life has value. Not just sentimental value, but real worth in a world that's lost connection to the earth. He reminded us who we are. The standing ovation that followed brought tears to Matteo's eyes. He'd spent 6 months feeling like the recipient of charity, the stranger who'd been welcomed despite having nothing to offer. But these people saw it differently. They saw contribution, leadership, something worth preserving. When the auction concluded and donations were tallied, the result was substantial but still short of what he needed. The gap was smaller now, maybe 30%, but it remained unbridgeable through community contributions alone. People apologized as they left, frustrated they couldn't give more. Matteo thanked each one genuinely. They'd given what they could, and more importantly, they'd shown him he mattered to them. Padre Tomas approached as others departed. The church wants to contribute from our emergency fund. It's not everything you need, but it's significant. Father, I can't accept that. The church needs those resources for real emergencies. This is an emergency. Losing you would devastate this community. What good is our mission if we don't use our resources to preserve something truly valuable? The church contribution closed more of the gap, but $2,000 still remained. 1 week until the tax deadline. Matteo sat alone in his garden that night, accepting what seemed inevitable. He'd given his best effort, and it wasn't enough. The land would be lost. But looking at what he'd built, the thriving ecosystem, the structures, the community connections, he felt an unexpected peace. He'd found what mattered. Even losing it couldn't erase what he'd learned and become. The knock on his cabin door came late the following evening. The woman standing there looked vaguely familiar, maybe 35, professional clothing, confident bearing. Matteo? I'm Veronica. I attended your first workshop a few months ago. He remembered then one of the original participants, quiet but intensely engaged. Of course. What brings you here? I've been thinking about your situation. The tax assessment, the fundraiser. I have a proposal. They sat at his small table, and Veronica explained. She directed a sustainable agriculture nonprofit focused on establishing educational demonstration sites. She'd been looking for a flagship location somewhere authentic, with proven methods and community integration. Your center could be that model, she said. Not just for this region, but potentially replicated elsewhere. My organization can provide investment, not charity, but actual partnership. We cover the tax payment and operational capital. You maintain control of daily operations and teaching. We document what works, create training materials, and help others establish similar centers. Revenue gets shared to sustain everything. Matteo's immediate reaction was resistance. Partnership meant less control, accountability to others, the risk of losing what made this place special. I understand your hesitation, Veronica said. You came here to escape complexity. But consider this isn't about building another business. It's about protecting what you've created and allowing it to multiply. Your authenticity is exactly what makes this work. I'm not here to change that. I'm here to help sustain and scale it. She left a contract for him to review, no pressure for immediate decision. But the tax deadline loomed. That night, Matteo walked his garden paths in darkness, seeking clarity. Every question led to the same insight. Nothing in nature grows alone. Mycorrhizal networks connect trees underground. Companion plants support each other. Even his garden thrived because of relationships with Felipe, with the community, with everyone who contributed knowledge and effort. His old life had failed because he'd built it on isolation and control. This new life succeeded because of connection and collaboration. By dawn, his decision was clear. He would trust again, build with others rather than alone, accept that growth sometimes meant accepting help. He signed the contract that morning. The tax payment was made that afternoon. The land was secure. The future, uncertain as always, at least existed. The partnership implementation began immediately. Veronica arrived with a small team, not corporate consultants, but people who understood agriculture, education, and community development. They spent days walking the property, observing workshops, interviewing community members. Their approach was respectful, seeking to enhance rather than replace what already worked. Felipe was offered a full-time position as operations manager. The salary meant he could support his family while continuing to learn and teach. The pride on his face when Matteo told him was worth more than any business success Matteo had achieved in his previous lives. Lupita became the official ethnobotany specialist, compensated for her lifetime of knowledge. She'd been sharing freely for years, never expecting payment. Now her expertise had formal recognition and value. Don Esteban's role was honorary but meaningful elder advisor, keeper of traditional methods. No physical labor required, just the wisdom he'd accumulated over 83 years. He could contribute without exhausting himself. The facility expansion proceeded thoughtfully. 3 additional cabins went up, designed to blend with the landscape. Solar panels were installed, making the center's sustainability match its teaching. Improved water systems demonstrated appropriate technology. A commercial kitchen allowed for value-added product development while maintaining health standards. The workshop schedule expanded to accommodate growing demand. They were booked solid for 6 months, with a waiting list developing. Media interest continued. Magazines focused on sustainable living, ecotourism publications, even a documentary crew wanting to film the operation. Matteo struggled with the attention. He'd come here seeking obscurity, and now cameras wanted to capture his transformation for public consumption. But Veronica helped him reframe it. Visibility wasn't about ego, it was about spreading ideas that could help others. A training program launched for people wanting to replicate the model elsewhere. Participants came for extended stays, learning not just gardening but how to build educational programs and sustain them financially. Within months, sister gardens were being established in 3 other regions, each adapted to local conditions but following the core principles. Knowledge was spreading like seeds on wind, exactly as it should. Then came the video call with Gabriela. 8 months since they'd last spoken in real time. Mateo's hands shook as he positioned his phone, finding an angle that would show the garden behind him. Her face appeared on screen older than he remembered, more mature, but unmistakably his daughter. The awkwardness was immediate and mutual. "Hi, Dad. Gabriella. It's good to see you." He gave her a virtual tour, walking through the garden with the phone, narrating what had been built. She watched with visible surprise, asking occasional questions. "I didn't know you had this in you," she finally said. "The dad, I remember, was always working, always stressed, always somewhere else mentally, even when he was physically present." The observation hurt because it was true. I didn't know I had it in me either. I had to lose everything to discover it. They talked for 40 minutes, not deep conversation, not reconciliation, but real communication. She told him about her nursing work, about relationships and career decisions. He listened without giving unsolicited advice, just being present in a way he'd rarely managed when she was growing up. "Andres asked about you," she mentioned near the end. "He's studying environmental science now. I think he'd be interested in what you're doing. He's always welcome here." Sophia's still angry. She needs more time. "I understand. I'm not going anywhere." Before disconnecting, Gabriella asked one more question. "Are you happy, Dad?" Matteo considered it honestly. "I am. For the first time in years, genuinely happy. Not because everything's perfect, but because what I'm doing matters to me." Relief crossed her face. "That's good. You deserve that." After the call ended, Matteo sat in his garden processing what had happened. Not a perfect reunion, not forgiveness granted or family restored, but a door had opened, and light was coming through. The garden's annual cycle was completing. Some plants were dying back as the season changed, making space for what would come next. Others were thriving, producing abundant harvests. Seeds were being saved for the next generation of growth. The community gathered for a dinner, celebrating the 1-year anniversary of Matteo's arrival. Stories were shared, remembering what the land had looked like then versus now. People credited Matteo, but he deflected. "The land did the work. I just paid attention and tried not to get in the way." Don Esteban's health had continued declining visibly. He attended the dinner but ate little, his energy clearly flagging. Afterward, he pulled Matteo aside for a private moment. "You've done something remarkable here. You brought life back to this place, reminded us what we're capable of." His voice was thin but firm. "That's enough for any man's legacy." The goodbye wasn't explicitly stated, but both men understood. Don Esteban was preparing to leave, making his peace. "Thank you," Matteo said, gripping the old man's hand. "For the tools, for the wisdom, for believing I could become something other than broken. You were never broken, just dormant, like seeds waiting for the right conditions." Don Esteban smiled. "Keep growing, Mijo. Always keep growing." That night, alone under the stars, Matteo planted a new tree, a memorial for Uncle Ramon, completing a circle. He knelt in the dark earth, placing the sapling carefully, and spoke to the uncle he'd never properly thanked. "Thank you for the gift I didn't understand until I needed it most. Thank you for seeing something in me I couldn't see in myself. I hope I've honored what you gave me." He patted soil around the roots, watering it thoroughly, securing the young tree against the night. It would grow slowly, reaching maturity long after Matteo was gone. But it would stand, a living testament to transformation, proof that from nothing, from loss and failure and despair, something beautiful could grow. 6 weeks after the anniversary celebration, Don Esteban passed away peacefully in his sleep. The entire village mourned, gathering for a funeral that celebrated a life well lived. Matteo stood at the front of the church, delivering a eulogy that came from deep in his heart. "Don Esteban taught me to see value where I thought there was nothing. He showed me that land remembers those who care for it, that patience is its own kind of strength, and that wisdom comes from attention rather than ambition. He didn't just give me tools, he gave me vision." They buried him in the village cemetery, and Matteo dedicated a section of the garden to Don Esteban's memory. The bench they'd sat on together so many evenings was moved to a spot overlooking the valley, with a simple plaque, Don Esteban. He knew the land remembers. Traditional crops Don Esteban had loved were planted around the memorial corn varieties his grandfather had grown, beans that had sustained his family for generations. The garden would keep his knowledge alive through every harvest. Life continued its rhythms. Workshops ran weekly, the educational center operating smoothly under Felipe's capable management. Sister sites in other regions were thriving, adapting the model to their own communities. The network was growing organically, knowledge multiplying through connection rather than control. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, Sophia appeared at the garden entrance. Matteo's heart stopped when he saw her. His youngest child, now 20, stood at the property edge, looking uncertain and guarded. She'd grown from the teenager he remembered into a young woman he barely recognized. Sophia. Her name caught in his throat. "Can I look around?" Her voice was careful, maintaining distance. "Of course. Let me show you." They walked the garden paths, in awkward silence at first. Matteo narrated what he'd built, explained the permaculture principles, pointed out plants from different regions. Sophia observed everything quietly, processing. She stopped at the children's learning area, a section designed for teaching young people about growing food. Small raised beds at kid height, colorful markers identifying plants, tools sized for small hands. "You never had time for this when we were kids," she said, her voice tight with old pain. Matteo didn't flinch from the truth. "You're right. I didn't. I was too busy building a business I thought mattered more than being present for you. I was wrong." They ended up at the memorial bench, sitting side by side overlooking the valley. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of hurt and absence. "I was so angry when you and Mom split," Sophia said finally. "Angry at both of you, but especially at you. You were never really there even when we were a family, and then you just disappeared completely. I know. I can't change that. I can only tell you that I understand now what I should have valued then. I failed you as a father long before the divorce." Her tears came, then grief for a childhood that wasn't what it should have been, for a father who'd been physically present but emotionally absent. Matteo's own tears mixed with hers, mourning the same losses from different sides. "Mom's happy now," Sophia said eventually. "Ernesto is good to her. He has time for her in ways you never did." "I'm genuinely glad she found that. She deserved better than what I gave her." There was no false reconciliation, no dramatic forgiveness. The pain was too real, too deep. But there was acknowledgement of hurt, of failure, of the possibility that healing takes time. "I saw the article about this place," Sophia admitted. "Gabriella sent it to me. At first I was angry that you'd found some new life while we—" She stopped, reconsidering. "But then I read it again. You weren't running away. You were putting yourself back together. This land saved my life. Literally. I had nothing and nowhere to go. But more than that, it showed me who I could be when I stopped trying to be who I thought I should be." Sophia stayed for dinner, meeting the community that had formed around the garden. She watched Matteo interact with students and neighbors, saw the respect and affection people had for him. The cognitive dissonance was visible on her face. This caring teacher versus the distant father she remembered. As evening fell, they walked back to her car. "I'm not ready to have you fully back in my life," she said honestly. "That's going to take time. But I'm glad you found this. I'm glad you're different now. I'm here whenever you're ready. No pressure, no expectations. Just here." The hug was brief, but real. Progress measured in moments, not declarations. Weeks passed. Gabriella sent a photo of her apartment balcony, a small container garden just starting, with the caption, "Learning from the best." Andres messaged, asking to visit during university break, interested in sustainable agriculture as potential career path. The door was opening gradually, organically, without force. The final workshop of the season, 2 participants from 5 countries. Matteo's teaching had refined into something powerful, confident, but humble, knowledgeable but still learning. He shared his personal story as a teaching tool, using vulnerability to create connection. During the closing ceremony, participants planted trees, a living legacy of their learning, a forest growing from shared knowledge. Each person's contribution, creating ripples that would continue long after they left. That evening, alone in his cabin, Matteo updated his seed collection album. He'd been documenting varieties, successes and lessons learned throughout the year. This record would be his gift to future growers, knowledge preserved and passed forward. He read through his journal entries, watching the year's transformation unfold in his own words. From desperation to determination to discovery. The garden story was his story, the same arc of breaking down and rebuilding differently. His final entry read, "What I thought was ending was beginning. What I thought was loss was gain. What I thought was exile was homecoming. The land taught me that true wealth isn't what you own, it's what you grow, in earth and in yourself. I came here with nothing, now I have everything that matters. Purpose, community, peace, hope, and a future I'm planting one seed at a time." Dawn arrived as it always did, light filtering through trees and painting the world in gentle colors. Matteo walked his familiar paths, noting what had changed overnight, what needed attention, what was ready to harvest. The garden continued its cycles, growth and rest, abundance and dormancy, death feeding life in endless renewal. He'd learned to trust those rhythms, to work with them rather than against them. Felipe arrived for the day's work, calling out a greeting. A new workshop group would arrive by afternoon. The community garden expansion needed planning. Life continuing in productive, meaningful patterns. Matteo paused at the newest section, where stakes marked future beds and designs were sketched. Always growing, always becoming, always reaching towards something more. His weathered hands touched soil that had transformed him as much as he'd transformed it. This was home, this was healing, this was enough. The camera would pull back now if this were a film, showing the garden from above, geometric beauty, where human design met nature's abundance. One man's transformation visible in transformed land. Proof that from nothing, everything meaningful can grow. On the memorial bench sat a seed packet, label written in Matteo's careful handwriting, "Plant with hope." The story was complete, but growth would continue forever.